Good morning and welcome. Glad you're here today. Want to remind you again this week that we have our Vacation Bible School starting this Thursday night, June 5th. Starts 6 p.m. and goes to 8. You can check the bulletin for RSVP if you want to show up for a simple meal beforehand and just share some time in fellowship. And you're welcome to bring your family to that and friends. Just RSVP so they have an idea beforehand who all is coming. But one other thing I want to make known to your attention is, first of all, this is not just for our kids. This is for our entire church. Last year, it had such an awesome feel where this was a congregational-wide event where there's a seminar for adults as well as the classes for the kids. And really the heart behind these seminars is how do we bring someone in that has an expertise in an area of discipling children, and that's applicable to us all, not only if you are like me and you have a newborn at home, or if you have a toddler or you have kids in high school, but also if you're a grandparent, or if there's any kids you influence in your life, which, by the way, every single person in this room it applies to because you're part of a church and there's kids in this church. And it takes villages, it takes congregations to raise up the next generation. And so I hope you know that that's for you. We've got an expert coming in for this seminar, sort of this town hall type seminar. And her name is Alicia Williamson. We'll teach that little workshop that'll happen while the kids are in classes. And so that's what you have to look forward to there. It's on the back. Get information about that on the back of the flyer. You don't need to RSVP for that. Just that'll be here in the auditorium. And I hope you'll be here for that. And then also, Sunday morning, a week from today, I won't be speaking next week. Instead, it'll be Alicia's husband, Carl Williamson, they're both professors at Harding. He's going to be doing the Bible class here in the auditorium, and so we won't have our various Bible classes next week. You'll be in here. And Carl will be teaching Bible class, and then he will also be preaching. He's going to be talking about the topic of disciple making. And so this is going to be wonderful. They're bringing the daughter up there with us, up here with them too. And so I hope you'll get to know that family as they're with us this week. We're excited to meet the Williamsons and excited to learn from their feet. And looking forward to Sunday morning as well next week as Carl leads our thoughts. So as we get started this morning, I want to ask you this question and then tell you a story. Have you ever felt completely unqualified for something you were asked to do? I know I have. And I don't know about you, I find myself in that position many times throughout life. And I remember once in particular, when I had graduated high school, I graduated on a Saturday, and then that evening, I believe, or maybe I graduated that week, and then the next day or the day after that, got in a car, packed up all my stuff. I was going to be heading to college that fall at Freed-Hardeman University. But before that, I had been asked to do an internship with a preacher in Columbus, at a church in Columbus. And I grew up in a smaller congregation. We didn't do a lot, weren't connected with a lot of other churches. And so I had very little experience. I had done a little bit of preaching, a little bit of teaching class, and done some devotionals, but very little. So I was really looking forward to, even before I started studying how to become a preacher at Freed, I was going to be able to shadow this preacher for the summer. And my task, I wasn't going to be the youth intern, but I was going to do some stuff with the youth group, just hang out with the youth group. But my main task was to learn to preach. And so I was probably scheduled, maybe that first summer, I think I was going to preach 3 sermons the entire summer. Maybe 6. I think that was the second summer I did it, but I think it was supposed to be 3 the entire summer. Those were going to be, do you guys remember when, we used to have Sunday night church and you come back, you go home and then come back, you take a nap, of course, get some food in, then you come back and you'd do a total do-over with a different topic. And this was one of those churches that still did that. And as we were, so that was when I was supposed to take, as the intern, okay, we had Sunday night church. It was kind of like you could kind of throw in one of those it's kind of a burner a little bit. Okay. And so they're like, we're going to throw the intern on Sunday night. Not as many people would come back. The intern will get some practice on Sunday nights. Well, I get there and I arrive. I'm totally kidding. All the worship services are of equal importance. Okay. Yeah. But people would dress down. Oh, okay, I'll move on. All right. It was a different feel. But so I was going to be doing that, but it was going to be weeks. The first time I was going to preach was going to be like a weekend, or several weeks in, so I was going to be training under that preacher and all that. Well, I get there, and he's immediately ends up sick in the hospital for weeks at a time. And so I get there that first week, and they tell me, all right, you're on Sunday morning. Like, okay, all right. And so I had to throw something together. Like I said, I'd done a little bit of preaching here and there. Our home congregation did a really good job of involving us and doing some speaking engagements and getting to preach. But I never used PowerPoint, never. Our church didn't do PowerPoint and felt very strongly against it for some reason. By the way, now they have it, so I guess, things change. But I'm there, and this church required, like, hey, we want you to put a PowerPoint slide together. And so I want to show you and I kind of now, 12 years later, I kind of pride myself, graphic design, Nick Hutchins, really good graphic design too. We kind of compare notes and talk about this. But here's my very first attempt at a PowerPoint and graphic design. I did a lesson. It was called The Instruction Manual of Life. This was it. This was the title slide. This wasn't clip art on slide 10 for an illustration like this. We didn't have much of a website at that time and didn't have a bulletin that would have like a picture of it. But this is what I put up on the screen. Like this was my grand lesson in my attempt at graphic design, which was just taking clip art probably off of Google Images and popping it on there. And then the rest of the slideshow didn't get much better. And so I thought, okay, this is going to be 1 week. The preacher's going to be back. We'll have I'll be able to go back to learning. But then he was out for several weeks. And so it was at least the first 3 weeks of that internship. I had to preach on Sunday mornings every single week. And I had only done like a couple lessons, and I had like 6 months to prepare beforehand. And now I've got to do it every single week. And so it was definitely learning by being thrown in the fire. And the funny thing is, I asked them, I was like, well, someone has to speak Sunday night. Do you want me to throw something together? And they kind of paused. And after they heard the first lesson, they're like, no, we'll get someone to fill in. Don't worry about it. And so they took care of that. They had some other people step up. And one's enough for you for now. Yeah, I learned on the spot, but I felt so unqualified. And I thought about this as we're doing the series on Exodus. I went back and I found this old clip art PowerPoint that I had back then. And I found one that I had done on the life of Moses before. And so, I like the graphic design we've done for this series in partnership with a graphic design module we use. But this was one I came up with. This was even 10 years ago when I was at Freed. Very different, and this was the PowerPoint, right? And this was by faith Moses, and had some images there. But have you ever felt that before? Have you ever felt unqualified for something you were asked to do? Maybe it was a job that you were looking to step into. Maybe it was a promotion in that job that you wanted. Of course, it's a promotion, better pay. But you're like, I'm going to have to kind of fake it till I make it. I'm not quite there. I'm not quite ready. Maybe it's leadership in your home. Maybe like me, it was when you first had your first child, and okay, things are different now. Got to step into, unqualified to be a parent. Maybe it's in terms of just dealing with the issues of life and dealing with relational issues, and we got to step into these like difficult situations sometimes, have hard conversations, and you feel called to, but you feel like you need to, but you feel unqualified to do so. Maybe you've been asked before, even here in Northeast, maybe you've been asked to step into a ministry before, whether it's just to participate, to be a part of something, to greet, or to be part of the tech team, or to even lead a ministry, and maybe you struggled because you didn't feel qualified to step into that project or to that ministry. Or maybe there's some of you in here this morning, maybe for you, it's to follow Jesus at all. And you know the story of Jesus, you know the story of Scripture, you've heard it, you've been here. And the only thing that's holding you back is I don't feel qualified enough to represent Christ to the world. I don't feel good enough to bear his name. Or maybe you are already a disciple of Jesus, and you know to be a disciple of Jesus is to follow Jesus, be changed by Jesus, to join the mission of Jesus. And the whole idea of jumping into the mission of God, the mission that Jesus calls us to become a disciple maker, not just be a disciple, but to be a disciple who makes disciples. And that kind of idea, when we talk about disciple making, we're talking about a spiritual mentorship, coming along people, life to life, being part of another person's life, helping guide them to be more like Jesus, to be changed by Jesus, then for them to join the mission of Jesus. And maybe that's intimidating. Maybe we feel called to it. But if you're like me, at times, maybe you feel unqualified to answer that calling. And if you find yourself in that position this morning, you're not alone. Last week, as we started this series on Exodus, and as we started this series on Exodus, we looked at the story so far is that Israel finds itself suffering in a foreign nation, in a foreign land, where Egypt has become their slave drivers, and Israel's growing and expanding, but the more it grows and expands, Egypt fears that they're going to rise against them. And so Egypt, the Pharaoh, the king at the time of Egypt, acts and oppresses the Israelites to suppress them, and hopefully they won't grow as much, and they'll know their place, and they won't be able to rise against us. And it's in that story in Exodus 1 through 2, where even though it doesn't seem like it, God's working in the background, raises up a person named Moses, a Hebrew, who is then raised by the Egyptians through all this supplanting of the Pharaoh's plans to eliminate all of the Hebrew boys being born at the time. But God works through these various people, through these small and faithful acts. And then that brings us to the point where we're going to pick up this week, where as God was raising up Moses, and he hears the people's cries, and he remembers his covenant that was made with Israel's ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and God prepares to act, and all of the first couple chapters of Exodus setting the scene for what God is about to do. But before God, quote unquote, does anything for Israel, he first calls Moses. And we saw the story of Moses' origins last week. And we realized the real hero of the story in Exodus 1 and 2 actually wasn't Moses, even though it kind of seems like, there's this figure being raised up. But we're drawn back to, but it's God who remembers his people. And it reminds us, even though he's not mentioned in the first several verses in chapter 1 and chapter 2, we get the end of chapter 2 and it says, God remembered his people. And we're like, okay. Now we get it. God's going to show up. God's going to be there and act for his people. But it starts with Moses. And as you look at the rest of Exodus chapter 2, which we kind of skipped last week because I wanted to talk about this morning, as we see Moses' first attempt at leadership. Again, Moses was a Hebrew boy who was separated from his family at birth in order to save him from this wicked Pharaoh's evil plans who wanted to kill all the Hebrew boys to sort of oppress and suppress them from growing and developing and take the strength from a generation. Yet Moses is delivered, and as we saw last week, he's actually raised by Pharaoh's own daughter and ends up being raised in Pharaoh's own household. And so he's raised as an Egyptian. Now, because God's working in the background, he actually gets close proximity to his family. Yet he's raised as an Egyptian. And we skip forward in time where he's a grown adult, about 40 years old at this time. And Moses sees the oppression that his people are receiving. And we're not totally positive all that he knew of the Hebrew people and whether he knew Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and all that story, but he knew that this was, apparently knew this was his people. Excuse me. And he sees an Egyptian attacking and oppressing one of his fellow Hebrew men. And Moses decides to take matters into his own hands at that point, and he actually kills the Egyptian, as we heard in our scripture reading this morning. He buries him in the sand. And this was Moses' way. We saw all these small, faithful acts of supplanting Pharaoh's plans. This is Moses' way of taking that, grasping it, and taking matters into his own hands. And it ended poorly for him. Because as he begins to try to lead his fellow Hebrews, and he sees these two Hebrews fighting, he said, guys, why are you fighting against one another? And they kind of turn to him and say, who are you to be our judge and our ruler, one who has committed murder and didn't even do it very well? You buried him in sand, right? And Moses realized at that point, one, he's caught. Pharaoh finds out what he has done, and he has to become a fugitive of Egypt. And he ends up, actually, so his first attempt at leadership is a total failure, and he actually ends up having to leave Egypt on his own, without his people, and he's exiled into a land called Midian, out in the wilderness, and he remains there for 40 years. And it's during this time that Moses gets married under Jethro, his father-in-law's household, and he has a couple kids, and 40 years pass by. And so what we learned there is that Moses' first attempt at leadership was a failure. And what we learn is this, is that zeal without wisdom and direction leads to disaster. And ultimately what we see in Moses' first attempt at leadership is this, is that he tried to lead by his own power and by his own strength. God was not in the picture in his way of leadership. And he paid the price for that, had to flee, just created a mess of his life, probably created more disaster and more oppression for his own people, the Israelites, because of his act. Yet, as we saw last week, even though Moses failed at leading, God did not leave his people to be oppressed. 40 years later, God remembers Israel at this time, but also, as we're going to see as we zoom forward 40 years to the calling of Moses. So as we said, Moses begins to put down some roots out in the wilderness as an exile, and becomes a shepherd of some kind for his father-in-law, Jethro. And one day, he's 80 years old at this point, he's out in the wilderness, and he's shepherding his flock. And as he's out there, he sees this burning bush. And it's amazing. It's not being consumed. It's just staying there. It's on fire. And it obviously draws his attention. And as he approaches the bush, first it says an angel of the Lord, but then it says God appeared to him in the bush. And he calls out to him. It says the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, and God called to him from within the bush. And he says, Moses, Moses. And Moses simply responds, here I am. Right, when God calls to you in a bush, it's time, okay, it's going to get my attention. Maybe we've had moments in our life where we're distracted, we're consumed with ourselves, or we've been in failure. And oftentimes in those moments, God gets our attention. And it's our job to listen up, whether that's God speaking to us through another person, whether it's him answering a prayer or putting us in a difficult situation where we're faced with very inconvenient and hard truth. Moses puts himself and positions himself before the bush and bows down. And God actually tells him, as the song we just sang, he says, remove your sandals, for this is holy ground. Moses is standing before the presence of God for the very first time. He's not the first one to do it. We see all kinds of stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in Genesis. Yet Moses, for the very first time. And we're not all that familiar with what Moses would have known about the God of his ancestors, as we're going to see. Yet he probably had heard of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from his mother and his sister, who were involved in his life, even though he was raised by Pharaoh's daughter. Yet he was still raised an Egyptian. And so we don't know exactly what he would have known. But nevertheless, if a figure talks to you through a burning bush, it gets your attention. And so Moses says, here I am. And this God who reveals himself in the bush, he calls Moses and he says, so now go. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And you think Moses would be exciting, because when you look at Exodus chapter 2, or you think he'd be excited because in Exodus chapter 2, remember, this is what he tried to do. He tried to take matters in his own hands to set his people free from the oppressed, at least one person at a time. but he did it by his own strength. He failed. He now found himself in exile. And 40 years later, you learn a lot of things in 40 years. And he's sitting there, no, I tried that once. I'm not about to go back. So you think you'd be excited. But instead we get in chapters 3 and chapter 4, you get these 5 objections that Moses makes to God through this calling, this grand calling to go and to bring God's people, Israelites, out of Egypt. It's a different Pharaoh, but as many movies and many shows kind of highlight, it's speculation, but I think it's more than likely true. Even though this was a new Pharaoh Moses would be going to, the old Pharaoh had died, Moses likely knew the new Pharaoh because he was raised in Pharaoh's own household. And who follows a king? One of his descendants. And so Moses likely knew him. So it's a tall order. I want you to think about even today, if you were talking about addressing a world superpower, whether they're oppressive or whether they're not, but can you imagine going to the White House and making claims and saying, if you don't answer my demands, my God's going to rain fire down on you? I think you'd be a little nervous when you look at the military might, like a nation like the United States. Well, Egypt was the world superpower of the day. This was a tall order. And to add to that, you've got all these like family dynamics to that, because Moses was raised in the household of the first Pharaoh, Pharaoh's daughter. We don't know who either one of these pharaohs are. There's a lot of speculation, but they likely would have been familiar. And so let's look at Moses' objections, because I think Moses was really just feeling a lot of what you and I feel when we've been called to something, and we are fearful because we feel unqualified. And I think we see that in Moses' objections here. So let's look at his first objection. You see that very clear in this first objection. In Exodus 3, verse 11, it says, "But Moses said to God, 'Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?'" And this is a fairly reasonable objection, because that is what the Israelites, those 2 Israelites men, had said to him 40 years ago. When Moses tried to take up the mantle of leadership, took matters in his own hands, and then tried to tell his fellow Hebrew brothers how they ought to act, what did they say? They said, "Who are you?" Or who set you? I kind of think of the phrase, "Who died and made you the big cheese?" Right? Who do you think you are to come and to rule and to be a judge over us? And 40 years later, those words have stuck with Moses. And he's asking that to this God who's appearing to him in this bush. He says, "Who am I?" And maybe sometimes you and I will struggle with that same type of question. Who am I to wade into that difficult situation and tell my brother or sister something that's hard? Who am I to assume to be a leader of a ministry, to step in and to provide clarity and vision to something? Who am I to presume that I've got this way of life that needs to be passed on to others, that I would tell my neighbors about it, or to tell people who are living different lifestyles? Who am I that I would think that my way is better than theirs? Or who am I? I don't have any skills or abilities to do that very thing, and maybe someone else would be better geared to do that. And oftentimes we might struggle with issues of self-confidence and self-assurance when we face those type of things. And what you might expect me to say is, be more self-confident. Have more faith in yourself. I don't think that those are bad messages in and of themselves, but that's not what I would say. Instead, I would point you to the one you should have confidence in. Because there's a part of ourselves in which we doubt, which is true, is that we're sinners, we're broken, we struggle, we mess things up. And so God doesn't say, "No, Moses, you are the one. Look at your," and here he doesn't list off all Moses' skills and say all these things. Instead, he says, and God said, "I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you and have brought you to the people out of Egypt and will worship God on this mountain." And so I would caution ourselves anytime we try to battle against ourselves, to battle issues of self-confidence with merit. Whenever we said, "Well, I'm struggling to do this. Well, look, I've done X, Y, and Z. I've led this, I've led that." When we do that, we create this like false sense of of self-confidence. But instead, what I would encourage you to do is to find your self-confidence within the God who made you, because he is immovable, he's sure, he's firm. And it's within that we can develop a self-confidence that's rooted in God, who created us as his image bearers, who loves us. That's where we ought to find confidence. And that's what God is pointing to him. He doesn't actually disagree with Moses of who are you. He just says, no, I've got this. I've got this. But then you have Moses' second objection, and this is so fascinating. He says, Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? And so Moses' first objection was, who am I? Moses' second objection is, well, who are you? Okay, you're going to be with me, but what does that mean? Who are you? And it's a bit unclear. Did Moses totally not know who this God was who was talking to him in the bush? Again, he grew up Egyptian, had Hebrew influences. Could he have forgotten over 80 years? Would you forget a few things over 80 years if it wasn't imprinted on you and you were in different settings? May have been. Did he fully know who the God of the ancestor of the Israelites was? That's a good question. I will say this. It's likely the Israelites did not forget. They knew the God of their ancestors, or they knew of him. They heard stories of him that were passed down through the generations. Yet Moses, maybe even sincerely, is wanting to know, who are you? And this is how God responds. It says, and God said to Moses, I am who I am. And this is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. And this is interesting, fascinating. A lot we could say here. This is basically a Hebrew phrase that says, I will be who I will be. And it's interesting. But what we find out is that it's likely a play on words with the actual name of God, which is, he tells us later, the Lord. And this is interesting. I know we could go into a lot on this, but basically, in the Hebrew, you have this name Yahweh, or Yod-He, Vav-He. And that's how we recognize the name of God. And it's found in Genesis, it's found in other places. So this is not the first time it's mentioned in Scripture. Yet I think what God is doing, he makes this play on words. The name Yahweh sounds very similar in Hebrew to this phrase, I am who I am. And so through this phrase, likely what he's doing is he's illuminating something about himself and about his name through this verb. He's not saying my name is I am who I am. His name is Yahweh, or at least that's my opinion. But it's tying them together. And so what does it mean to say, or to call God Yahweh? He's saying, well, it's this God who just is. He in the words of another, he's this consistent force, this being that does not change. God is not shaped by others. He's not changed by others. Human beings, you and I, we change form. We change over time. We are shaped by others. I heard a preacher a few weeks ago talk about, when you and I spend time with each other, we tend to become more like each other. We are shaped or formed. I hope that Samuel, as he grows, he's going to be a little bit like Cassidy, at least the good parts, and he can leave the bad parts out, right? If life was that ideal. So he gets all Cassidy's qualities, and then I guess he's not much like me, and Cassidy's saying, yes, absolutely. But you think about it, it's shaping and forming of human beings. God's not shaped like that. He is who he is. He doesn't change. He is consistent. He's firm. And I think that play on words, and again, we could go a lot more into that, but just to sum it up so we can move on, is God is saying is the one who is, always has been, and always will be, is the one addressing you in the bush. And his name is Yahweh. And by the way, a little bit extra, the reason you see the Lord, and maybe you've heard this before, maybe you haven't, is in Hebrew, you only have consonants, you don't have vowels in the original language. And so what very pious Jews did is they took the Greek word Adonai, which is Lord, and they took the vowels from the word Adonai, and they fit it in between the consonants of Yahweh, and that's where you get the name Jehovah, if you've ever heard the name Jehovah. A really interesting, kind of fascinating piece. And so a lot of English translations just put that as Lord in all caps, and that tells you that's the name of God. That's Yod-He, Vav-He, Yahweh. And Yahweh is the one who does not change. He's not shaped, but he's this ultimate reality, past, present, and future, that has created all things, sustains all things, and holds all things together. And this is what he's to go and to tell the Israelites. Say to the Israelites, Yahweh, the Lord, or the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has sent me to you. And he says, this is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. And as the implication is, the Israelites would have understood who that was. At least I think that's the implication. As they knew the God of their fathers. And when Moses came to them and said, the God of your fathers has sent me. And they're like, who is he? And I said, Yahweh. And much like before Jesus, when Jesus says, I am, when the prisoners came to arrest him on the night of his crucifixion, and it scattered people, they fell to the ground like a lightning strike, and thunder had hit the ground. That's the kind of effect the name of God would have had on the people of Israel. And so God says, Yahweh says, go to them and say, Yahweh, the one who is, always has been, and always will be, has sent you. He has heard your cries, the implication is, and he's here to deliver you. And so who am I? Who are you? Then the third objection goes back to Moses. And he says, Moses answered, well, what if they don't believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? And that really probably goes down to a fear that many of us have of stepping into leadership, of reaching out to our neighbor, of investing in others to lead them to Christ or to share your faith or to address a difficult situation. The fear is, well, what if they don't listen? Like and what Moses is really saying is, I tried that. They didn't believe me when I stepped into leadership before. What if they don't listen? What if they don't believe? And God then, to kind of go quickly through this, God then gives him 3 different signs, miraculous signs, in order to show the Israelites. The staff would go to a snake, Moses' hand would become leprous, and then it would be healed. Help me out on the third one. Does anyone know the third one? Oh, it's he takes some of the water of the Nile and sprinkles it on the ground, and it turns into blood. And that would be a sign to the Israelites. Before we get into any kind of plague or any kind of thing, be a sign to the Israelites that this was Yahweh who had appeared to Moses. Okay, so he answers Moses' third objection. What's Moses' fourth objection? Again, it goes back. He puts the emphasis back on himself. And Moses said to the Lord, pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant, and I'm slow of speech and of tongue. Again, he says, I'm not good enough. I don't have the skills. I don't have the abilities to do what you would have me to do, to address the elders of the Israelites, to address the Israelites, or to address Moses. I simply don't have the skills. I'm unqualified in order to do it. And I love God's response, because this is really similar to the first response, or the first objection that Moses makes to God. And this time, God doesn't say, I'm going to be with you. Instead, he says this: who gave human beings their mouth? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, Yahweh, the Lord? And Moses got this, I'm not skilled enough with the mouth to talk, to address these people. He said, I gave you your mouth. And again, the emphasis is, trust in me, Moses. I'm asking you to step in on my behalf, for me to work through you. Because Moses is still leaning. All these objections are all about Moses putting it on himself, grasping leadership for himself, rather than simply allowing God to work through him. And so he again says, now go. God's heard his objections and says, now go, and I will help you speak, and I will teach you what to say. And then Moses still has a fifth objection. And this one's just like very, very forward. And Moses says this. He says, pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else. Have you ever done that before? And can you imagine Moses doing this, by the way? Listen, God, I've prayed about it, I've discerned, and I don't think this is for me. I don't feel called to this. And God's like, no, I'm calling you to it. This is in this instance, he's not asking him to do it. God's telling him. And so Moses is learning. This is not about me. This is about who God is and what he's calling me to do. And so if you look at the various points of Moses' life and his attempts at leadership, you could look at it. So much of Moses' life has been, how can I accomplish this great purpose for Egypt? To, I'm not good enough, I can't do it, to God calling him. And Moses still say, no, I'm not good enough, I can't do it, I've tried it. And God says, it's not within your power to do it. It is through God's own power, his sustaining power, his creative power, his all-knowing, all-powerful, omnipresent power that's in with the God. It's not found within Moses, but God was calling him to stand on his behalf. And so lastly, he says, the Lord said to Moses, listen, and it says God became angry at Moses actually, because Moses was resisting the call of God, because he made it more about him rather than the one who was calling him. And so it says, the Lord said to Moses, now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. In other words, your hands aren't doing anything in this. It may look like it generations after. We'll talk about this hero of the faith named Moses. But God's making very clear, you're not the hero. You're just standing before them on my behalf. And my hand is going to be the one that grips and rips Israel out of the evil hands of Egypt. And that's the same for you and I. When we're asked to step into something hard, we're asked to become disciple makers, we're asked to provide leadership for our families. It has nothing to do with our skills, our abilities, our qualifications. It is God's mighty hand working through us. And that ought to give us true self-confidence, because it doesn't matter who am I. It's who is he, and my life is rooted in his existence and his power. But as we wrap this up, a couple thoughts here. As we look at God's calling to Moses and what he's calling him to do, what we realize is that calling is really just about partnership. That God is wanting to partner with Moses. And when you think about it, why does God even need Moses? Why can't he just strike Pharaoh down, allow the Israelites to just depart from the land? And there's really no reasonable explanation other than when you go back to Genesis, we learn that God always, his purpose for humanity has always been for right relationship and right partnership with his image bearers. And I think that's what this is all about. Calling is about partnership. That's true for Moses, and that's true for you today. In whatever situations you find yourself in today, the story is not about us, it's about God, but God is calling us to look past ourselves and to look into his mission and what he's doing in the world. And ironically, when we do that, we become our true selves. We become how we were created to or we become who we were created to actually be and to find real peace and real satisfaction in life. Here's a hard reality. And maybe you weren't expecting to hear this on a Sunday morning, but God does not need you. Amen? God does not need you. He doesn't need me. But for whatever reason, and I think it's rooted in his character, it's rooted in his love, he genuinely wants you. Doesn't make sense, but he wants to partner with you. He wants to take weak, broken people, even by the world standards, these strong people of pride, and he wants to use us, humble us, but use us for his good purposes. And maybe you're still thinking, but I'm not qualified. Why? How can I respond to the God's call? I'm not going to be able to do what he's called me to do. Remember this, God is not calling you because you have already arrived. He's calling you to take you to a place you've never been. And that's what it means to respond to the call of God. And you've maybe heard this before. I think it's a powerful thought here, is that God does not call the qualified, he qualifies the called. And God does not call the equipped, the skilled, the ones who are already can accomplish the job without him. But God equips the call. And so I don't know what God's calling you to this morning. Whether it's to step in and be the leader your family needs, or whether it's to say yes to a ministry opportunity that one of the elders has been kind of nudging you and asking you to step into, but you felt hesitant. Not that there's not a time to say no, but maybe there's a time to say yes, and this is now. Maybe it's to use your voice to to address a difficult situation, to step into conflict, address a difficult situation. You rather just put that behind and feels Christian to not address conflict, but in reality, there's a calling right in front of you to solve an issue, to address someone. Maybe it's to reach out and to start showing hospitality to your neighbors. We talk about that idea all the time, but it seems big. You seem unqualified. What are we going to talk about? How am I going to lead them to Jesus? But maybe God's calling you to that this morning and calling you to start investing through spiritual mentorship and making disciples of lost people. Whatever it might be, remember, God does not expect you to have all the answers now. And I get it. Sometimes I'm kind of like that. I don't want to just step into something unless I've got it kind of mapped out. Are you like that? I'm a bit like that. I trust in God, but I've got plan B there just in case. Just in case, because life's a little chaotic. And that's how we are. And so maybe whatever it is, and I can't answer this question for you this morning, whatever you're feeling called to, whatever opportunities are coming your way, and you know it's good to act and to step into, and you feel like God is nudging you towards a certain direction, yet you're struggling with this. And instead of expecting to have all the answers and to everything figured out before you act, remember, God does not call the equipped. He equips you because you are called. And when you become a follower of Jesus and you see good that you ought to do, not that it's not good to prepare ourselves. I did that. I try to work and to prepare and all of that. Nevertheless, my trust is not in my own preparation, but it's through the equipping God does through me. God's going to equip you for that which he calls you. And so whatever it is this morning that you feel called to, the challenge for you is not to say, God, who am I? Or to fix all your imperfections before you step in. The challenge for you this morning is to respond to God simply this: here I am. God, use me for your purposes. I trust in you. You're the God who gave me a mouth. You're the God who gives me eyes. You're the God who gives me feet to walk and to do your will. Here I am. That's where the calling starts. And from there, God equips us to do his good work. If you're here this morning, whatever your need might be, maybe you're feeling called this morning to step out, to become a disciple of Jesus this morning, but you've struggled with these feelings of inadequacy and being unqualified. And the truth is, left by our own devices, we are. Yet we step before Christ. We say, here I am. I want to be your disciple. I want to join your mission. And we submit to him through faith, repentance, and baptism, and we become his followers to live out his will. And you can do that this morning. The baptistry is prepared. We'd love to sit down and talk to you about that. Or if you're here this morning and maybe there's just some issues going on in your life, whatever it might be, and you're hearing God's call through those opportunities, and you want to sit down and discern those things. Some of our shepherds, our elders, will be in the prayer room. If you'll exit here on my left and go down the hallway, you'll see the prayer room on your first, or on my right, and as you go down the hallway, it's on the left. And we invite you to step into there and sit with some men who love you and care for you and want to help you respond to God's calling for your life. Whatever your need might be, we invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.